happening on the battlefronts? Well, there's been a lot of fighting apparently in and around Bakhmut. The Russians are pressing hard. The Wagner assault forces at their vanguard, unquestionably, to try and capture this town of Berchova, which is, as I said, the next settlement in the line Krasnaya Gora, Paraskovievka. Berchova is the next one. Once Berchova is taken, the roads leading into Bakhmut become, from what I can understand, completely unusable, and Ukraine is then reduced to its country lanes and fields if it's going to continue to keep its troops in Bakhmut fighting. And there's been more reports now that the fighting has indeed reached the very center of Bakhmut. There's also reports that a major factory within the industrial area of Bakhmut in the north is now coming under attack. Ukraine likes to convert these factories into heavily defended fortifications, and no doubt there'll be a bitter fight for this particular factory. But of course, if Ukrainian troops in Bakhmut are starting to run out of supplies and ammunition, then their ability to cling on to this factory starts to dim. And elsewhere on the battle lines, as I said, we've got more reports of more Russian advances in the Kremenaya area. 4 kilometers, allegedly. This is, by the way, come from a Ukrainian source, that the Russians have pushed forward 4 kilometers in the Kremenaya area. I'm not exactly certain where that is, and they're pushing further towards Kupiansk. And yesterday, I also reported the fact that the Russians seem to be deploying around 5,000 men to the Vuhledar area to join the forces which have been fighting there. And no doubt, at least I expect, that there will be a further assault on Vuhledar at some point within the next coming days. Now, the big question is this all the Russian winter offensive? And I'm making this observation because there's been another outstanding video in the outstanding series of videos published by Brian Beletic on the New Atlas. And Brian Beletic references an article co-written by Michael Kaufman, who, as I say, is a strongly pro-Ukrainian military commentator and analyst, but someone whom I take extremely seriously. I think on many occasions he's been a very insightful commentator, and has been so, by the way, for a long time, since long before the start of this war. Michael Kaufman thinks that the Russian winter offensive is already underway. It's been proceeding in a slow, incremental fashion, as he says, but this is supposedly the Russian winter offensive, and Michael Kaufman says that this is a huge mistake, and it's all based upon the assumption that the Russians ought to instead be staying on the defensive, building up their forces, and by going on the attack now, allegedly under pressure from the Kremlin, the Russians are losing lives and equipment at a huge rate. This is what Kaufman seems to think, and thus they're weakening themselves in advance of the Ukrainian spring offensive, which is to come. Now, Brian Beletic takes a completely different view. He says that this isn't actually a big winter offensive. It is rather a case of the Russians putting pressure on every part of the front line, keeping the Ukrainians overstretched and overextended, burning up Ukrainian soldiers and munitions, preventing the Ukrainians building up their forces in the rear, so that weakening thereby any offensive that Ukraine does launch in the future. Now, on this argument, I come down entirely on Brian Beletic's side. And I say this even though at one point, back before the new year, I did think that the Russians probably were going to launch some kind of offensive over the course of the winter. But the facts actually, and let's put aside speculations, let's focus instead on facts. The facts tell a different story. The number of Russian troops involved in all of these attacks is relatively small. And most of the units that have been involved are the same units that have been fighting in this conflict zone ever since the start of the present period of the fighting back in February last year. We're not seeing vast columns of armored vehicles and tanks. We aren't seeing huge numbers of infantry being thrown into the battle. Only yesterday, I said that one Ukrainian official said that there were 190 battalions of Russian troops stationed now in Donbass, in the Donetsk area. Well, they are not engaged in any particular fighting at the moment. The number of troops who are going to be deployed, apparently, in and around Vuhledar, which, as I said, is a major point of the Ukrainian defense forces. Well, we've just been told that they're going to be reinforced by around 5,000 men. That's about a reinforced brigade's worth. Hardly the stuff of giant offensives. And in Bakhmut, all the indications are that the forces that have been deployed there have been reinforced, they have got stronger, but not by orders of magnitude. What has been happening is that the Russians have conducted a kind of siege war operation in and around Bakhmut. They've gradually been breaking the Ukrainian defenses, and that's enabling them to incrementally win the Battle of Bakhmut. So, given that this is so, I have to say that I agree with Brian Beletic's view. This is the Russians keeping the Ukrainians under constant pressure, not allowing the Ukrainians time to build up stocks of ammunition, not allowing the Ukrainians time to build up large reserves of troops in their rear, weakening whatever offensive Ukraine does eventually launch over the next few weeks and months. I am going to say one thing, though, which is slightly in conflict with what Brian Beletic says. It's not really in conflict. I mean, it complements him. I do think that the Russians are indeed where they are pushing forward in order to realize specific objectives. For example, I think that it is undoubtedly the Russian objective to capture Bakhmut, just as before it was undoubtedly the Russian objective to take Soledar. I think the Russians want to take Bakhmut. They want to capture the hills to the west of Bakhmut. They want to be in a position where they can put their artillery on those hills and start shelling Slavyansk and Kramatorsk, the next Ukrainian defense line, the last Ukrainian defense line in Donbass. So I think that is what the Russians are generally seeking to do in Bakhmut. In other words, this is a real Russian advance in Bakhmut, not just an attempt to keep the Ukrainians busy, overextended, overstretched, to degrade their forces in Bakhmut. Though that does, of course, play a significant role in this. And the same is true in Vuhledar. This has been a difficult fight for the Russians, capturing Vuhledar. It's been also, by the way, a difficult fight for the Russians in the Marinka area, which is connected to Vuhledar. But I do think that the Russians do intend eventually to capture Vuhledar and to break Ukrainian defenses in and around Donetsk city. This is not going to be the work of some big arrow offensive. It's going to be the work of steady siege tactics of the kind that we've seen. The ones around Vuhledar, particularly difficult because Vuhledar is the high ground and it's difficult to capture, therefore, and there's no doubt at all that the Russians have suffered losses there, but eventually, no doubt, they will capture Vuhledar, just as eventually they will capture Bakhmut. And in the Kremenaya area, I think it's a little different. I think that the Russians have probably calculated that whatever offensive Ukraine launches is not going to be so much in the Kremenaya Svatovo area. It's more likely to happen in the south, towards the Sea of Azov. After all, that's what the Ukrainians are telling us. But here again, I think that the major purpose of the pressure the Russians are putting on the Ukrainians is to gain ground, definitely, to degrade Ukrainian troops, to grind them down, in other words, but also to improve the Russian defensive position in this part of the conflict area, to restore the Oskol River line, for example, which could mean capturing Kupiansk, to push Ukrainian defensive forces back beyond Kremenaya, to, in other words, make any Ukrainian attack in this part of the conflict zone more difficult than the one that the Ukrainians launched back in September, when the Ukrainians were able to attack in Kharkiv region against heavily depleted Russian troops, a very reduced number of Russian troops. So that's my own personal view. Overwhelmingly, as I said, I agree with Brian Beletic about this. I don't think that this is the big Russian offensive. I think this is more a case of putting pressure, as he says, on the battle lines, keeping the Ukrainians engaged, grinding them down. But I do make those qualifications that I've just said, which I don't actually think detract from Brian Beletic's overriding underlying point. I would just, again, reiterate that I don't know what the Russians are planning. And one other point Brian Beletic has made, which is absolutely correct, it's fully sound, is that no Russian official, and I think I could say this, he's speculating about this a little, but I can confirm, I think, with fair confidence that what he's saying is true. No Russian official at any level, not Putin, not the defense minister, Shoigu, not Surovikin, the probable theater commander, not General Gerasimov, the chief of the general staff, none of the officials, the top officials of the Donetsk and Lugansk People's Republics, not the officials in Kherson and Zaporozhye region. None of them have spoken about some grand winter offensive by the Russians. Some of these officials from the four regions have discussed particular advances that are taking place, but it's clear that they're not talking about the kind of great grand offensive that Michael Kaufman is to some extent talking about. And again, just as a piece of history, and we are talking about a military, the Russian military, which is deeply historically minded, as, by the way, the Russian political class also is. I would just say again that in 1943, the tactics of building up defenses, strengthening one's forces, piling up reserves, was exactly what the Russians did, in the knowledge that the Germans would launch an offensive, and the Germans did duly launch an offensive, a place called Kursk, and the Russians blunted that offensive, and it was once they blunted that German offensive that the Russians felt able to go on the attack. Obviously, the scale is completely different, but perhaps the strategy is approximately the same.